Hello, everyone, and a big warm welcome to all of you to this live stream. I'm going to be going through the new document from the Vatican this evening. It's evening here where I am, and I basically just want to understand the document by going through it myself. Not that I think I can, it's not like I'm going to just interpret everything by myself and not talk to other people, but I've noticed sometimes with these documents that get released by the church, it's so easy to be swept up in the kind of media storm of personalities and corporations that want to give you this information. And what can happen as a consequence is, at least it's happened to me, is where I feel like I have a very good understanding of of the document, even though I might not necessarily have actually gone through it. Now, I'm not a theologian, nor am I a professional philosopher by any stretch. I'm just a layman. I'm just a Catholic. And I felt like I needed to go through this. I don't have much time throughout the day except for these evenings with you guys. So I thought, why not just do it on an episode? Why not just go through it casually? The way I see it is people that are not interested in this stuff won't bother watching it anyway, but the people that are interested would probably enjoy it. So I'm going to go through that document. Dignitas Infinita, I believe, is the correct name. I'll put it up on the screen in just a moment so you guys can actually see, you can see it with me as we go through it. I doubt I'm going to read every single section. I might skip the introduction, but we'll see as we go. This might be a very long stream. Then, before I actually even start by going through Dignitas, I would like to first just reflect a little bit with you on something that G.K. Chesterton said when it comes to the authority of the church, and sort of reflect a little bit on why the church makes these declarations. I have already seen, even though I've tried to avoid it, I've already seen some people saying that it wasn't necessary for the church to make some of these statements, that these are things that the church has always taught. So what's the point of releasing something like this? I'm not going to pretend like I know all the reasons, but I do think that just looking at what Chesterton said on what it means to be Catholic, I think I will find it helpful, and maybe you will too. So that's where I'd like to begin. And then we'll move into the actual document. So let's actually get started right now. I hope you guys had a good day. I don't know what time zone you're in. It is currently about 8:30 here where I am in the evening, which is not that late for me. So anyway, I hope you had a good day. Let's get started. On my screen now, you should in a moment see the article from Chesterton called Why I Am a Catholic. I actually have a reading of this on my channel, but to be honest with you, I haven't actually read this whole piece since I recorded that video. And I think there's a few things he says here that I like to remind myself of occasionally, especially when there is supposed controversy in the church. So, the top quote is just that the church is not merely armed against the heresies of the past or even of the present, but equally against those of the future, which is a theme that you're going to see throughout this. So I doubt, again, I'm going to read this whole thing. I just want to point out a few points here. So the first line is obviously great. I'll just read that, which is that the difficulty of explaining why I am a Catholic is that there are 10,000 reasons, all amounting to one reason, that Catholicism is true. He then gives a few different examples. I think one of the comedic ones is number 5, where Chesterton says, it's the only type of Christianity that really contains every type of man, even the respectable man, which is quite witty. And then I love number 6, which is, it is the only large attempt to change the world from the inside, working through wills and not laws, and so on. Okay, so let's jump a little bit down, because again, I'm not going to read this whole thing. I just want to talk about what Chesterton says when he reflects on what the Catholic Church is really doing, what the Catholic Church is trying to help us understand. So I'd like to begin here, where Chesterton says, 9 out of 10 of what we call new ideas are simply old mistakes. I mean, this is such a deep idea already. The Catholic Church has for one of her chief duties that of preventing people from making those old mistakes, from making them over and over again forever, as people always do if they are left to themselves. The truth about the Catholic attitude towards heresy, or as some would say, towards liberty, can best be expressed perhaps by the metaphor of a map. The Catholic Church carries a sort of map of the mind, which looks like the map of a maze, but is in fact a guide to the maze. It has been compiled from knowledge, which, even if you just consider it as knowledge that comes purely from humans, it really isn't without any human parallel. There is no other case of one continuous, intelligent institution that has been thinking about thinking for 2,000 years. Its experience naturally covers nearly all experiences, and especially nearly all errors. And of course, this is relevant to the document from the Vatican we're going to be reading soon. The result is a map in which all the blind alleys and bad roads are clearly marked, all the ways that have been shown to be worthless by the best of all evidence, the evidence of those who have gone down them. On this map of the mind, the errors are marked as exceptions. The greater part of it consists of playgrounds and happy hunting fields. So the majority of this mind map, this guide to the maze, this what looks like a maze, but it looks like a map to a maze, but is really a guide. There's a lot of freedom and joy within the structure of the church. The church wants to help you become fully alive. The glory of God is a man fully alive, right? A human being fully alive. And that means there are going to be limitations. And so those limitations are really the exceptions. Majority of the time, the walls of the playground are there so that the children within the walls can have as much fun as they possibly can. So the walls aren't really just walls of a prison. They are walls of a playground. Those limits, those barriers, those points that the church advises to avoid, things to be careful of, are really there to try and help you. And it's ultimately up to you if you're going to acquiesce to that, if you're going to submit to that. And that's a personal struggle that everybody has, including me, between wanting to choose what I think I should do versus what the institution that's been thinking about thinking and thinking about errors and thinking about ways that people take themselves to hell for 2,000 years has to say about it. It's me versus that. So, I mean, it's not in this essay, but Chesterton says something somewhere like, it's difficult to become a Catholic because you have to admit that there might be something out there that's smarter than you, that isn't God, and that would be the church and the authority of the church. So, that's really what he means when he says these errors or these problems that we lead ourselves into are really the exceptions. The greater part of it consists of playgrounds and happy hunting fields where the mind may have as much liberty as it likes, not to mention any number of intellectual battlefields in which the battle is indefinitely open and undecided, because of course there are many things we can still discuss and debate about and figure out. And that's another point that's relevant to as times change, there are going to be new problems. Of course, again, 9 out of 10 new ideas are just old mistakes, but there are going to be what seem to us to be like new problems. But you'll find that there's nothing new under the sun, and the church is already advised on a lot of these things. But when something seems to be new, it still goes back to the root problems. So even if there's a new let's say something like surrogacy, which is a point that the document talks about, even though that's quite new, what it's doing is still very old, which is as the church shows, it's a violation of human dignity, and that's what this document is going to talk about. And it's so alone in its promulgations. I was watching a news show this morning, just a clip on YouTube. I'm sure you've watched one of those before, where there's just, it's like a 3 or 4 minute clip where somebody discusses a point, right? And they were talking about this document. And I said to myself I was going to avoid these videos, but I couldn't resist, and I watched this one. And the news anchor said something like, the church is still against these things even in 2024. And it's like, well, the church isn't really in the times, right? It's beyond the times. And we need something like that. We need something that's willing to speak out against everything. Because if the world kind of gets really bad, we need the church to stay good and to say something to the world. But if, let's say that the church didn't do that, if the church just went with the world, then the world would never rebuke the church. The world would never say to the church, hey, you're not telling us what we're doing. You're not telling us about the things that are hurting us. The world generally doesn't do that in the same way that individual sinners, I mean, I guess I can only speak for myself, but in the same way that, God might rebuke me, but if I'm doing things wrong, I don't necessarily rebuke myself as easily. I might need to experience some suffering before I realize I might have made a grave mistake. So that's perhaps not the best metaphor. But having said all of that, let's continue with this piece. And I want to go to this line here, which says, by this means, it does, the church, prevent men from wasting their time or losing their lives upon paths that have been found futile or disastrous again and again in the past, but which might otherwise entrap travelers again and again in the future. The church does make herself responsible for warning her people against these, and upon these the real issue of the case depends. She does dogmatically defend humanity from its worst foes. And what are those worst foes? Well, Chesterton says, those hoary and horrible and devouring monsters of the old mistakes. Now, all these false issues have a way of looking quite fresh, especially to a fresh generation. Their first statement always sounds harmless and plausible. I'll give 2 examples. It sounds harmless to say, as most modern people have said, actions are only wrong if they're bad for society. Chesterton says you should follow this out, and sooner or later you'll have the inhumanity of a hive or of a heathen city, establishing slavery as the cheapest and most certain means of production, torturing the slaves for evidence because the individual is nothing to the state, declaring that an innocent man must die for the people, as did the murderers of Christ. Then perhaps you'll go back to Catholic definitions and find that the Church, which she also says it is our duty to work for society, says other things also which forbid individual injustice. Or again, it sounds quite pious to say, quote, our moral conflict should end with a victory of the spiritual over the material. Well, follow it out, you may end in the madness of the Manichaeans, saying that a suicide is good because it's a sacrifice, and that a sexual perversion is good because it produces no life, that the devil made the sun and moon because they are material. Then you may begin to guess why Catholicism insists that there are evil spirits as well as good, and that materials also may be sacred, as in the incarnation or the Mass, this in the sacrament of marriage or the resurrection of the body. So I have a lot of Protestant friends who will talk to me often about Catholicism, and I think a point that keeps coming up again and again is that people seem to think that a Catholic might have an allegiance to the Pope because of the Pope, but really a Catholic has an allegiance to the Pope only because we have an allegiance to Christ. We have an allegiance to the Pope only because we believe that the Pope has that authority because Christ gave it to him. So the Pope sits in the chair of St. Peter. He's the successor of Peter. This is not new information. I'm sure if you're watching this show, you're probably very well aware of these points. But I think it's important to remember that if you're not Catholic, you've got to try and look at it from the Catholic perspective. You know, it's not like we have some allegiance to the man who is the Pope separate from our allegiance to Christ. Our allegiance to the the Supreme Pontiff is an extension, a consequence of our allegiance to Christ, always. If Christ is not there, there's no allegiance at all. So this brings me into one last point I want to make, and then we're going to look at the document. So Chesterton has this great point where he talks about the fact that some people criticize the church for being too harsh in some areas, but then too lenient in others. So, people will criticize. A good example would be Pope Francis, where they'll criticize Pope Francis and say, some people say he's too liberal, and now people are saying he's too conservative. And Chesterton says, if lots of people are calling me fat, and lots of other people are calling me thin, then probably I'm somewhere in the middle, and I'm probably a good balance. Now, that to me is a point that I just thought about a little bit earlier today, and I think it's something worth thinking about. Obviously, every individual has a unique perspective on Pope Francis, and I remember this morning in that same news show I watched, the guest mentioned something like Pope Francis is almost like a Rorschach test, where people look at him and see what they want to see, right? So people see the liberal elements, or they see the conservative, or even when he's conservative, some people see the liberal, and even when he's liberal, some people just see the conservative. But I keep coming back to that line by Chesterton. If a lot of people are saying I'm fat and lots of people are saying I'm thin, probably I'm somewhere in the middle, and I'm neither one of the extremes. So, having said all of that, let's talk about existential dignity, and let's talk about the declaration Dignitas Infinita. Sorry guys, I'm just going to put myself over here. Okay. So, the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, the declaration Dignitas Infinita, which by the way sounds, forget everything else, it just sounds exceedingly cool. I love that name. So, on human dignity, I'm going to skip this presentation, or the introduction. There are actually 66 sections, 66 paragraphs. I'll begin with number 1. So it says, every human person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being, which prevails and beyond every circumstance, state, or situation the person may ever encounter. This principle, which is fully recognizable even by reason alone, underlies the primacy of the human person and the protection of human rights. In the light of revelation, the Church resolutely reiterates and confirms the ontological dignity of the human person, created in the image and likeness of God and redeemed in Jesus Christ. From this truth, the Church draws the reasons for her commitment to the weak and those less endowed with power, always insisting on the primacy of the human person and the defense of his or her dignity beyond every circumstance. I work in corporate training, and I've worked in corporate training for many years, and I've worked with a lot of employees, and I've been to a lot of different industries and a lot of different companies, and it's usually easier to give dignity to somebody that you see as your superior. So you'll see a lot of employees will almost unthinkingly give a great deal of honor, a great deal of respect, and which is effectively dignity, as a consequence of someone's dignity. They'll do that to the superior, to the CEO, to the manager, etc. And it's easy, in a way, to give dignity when we think somebody's of a very high position and that they deserve it. The problem is that we, as fallen people, we sometimes judge people before the fact, and then we place them in a category, and sometimes we treat those people with less dignity based on the assumptions we've made about them. And it's easier, I think, and when I say easier, I mean it's easier to fall into that trap when you're dealing with maybe somebody who is really struggling, maybe say a homeless person. I sometimes think it's sometimes more difficult to see the dignity that person has as a child of God. So I understand, and I'm obviously going to read this charitably, but I understand this point very much, that you actually have to kind of emphasize the fact that the dignity applies to the weak. The dignity applies to the people that we find it, also applies to the people that we really find it harder to see that dignity in. We have to remember that they also have this dignity, even our enemies. Chapter 2, I'm just going to call them chapters. This ontological dignity and the unique and eminent value of every man and woman in the world was reaffirmed authoritatively in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, issued by the United Nations General Assembly on 10 December 1948. As we commemorate the 75th anniversary of that document, the Church sees an opportunity to proclaim anew its conviction that all human beings, created by God and redeemed by Christ, must be recognized and treated with respect and love due to their inalienable dignity. That word's going to mess me up tonight. Inalienable dignity. The anniversary also provides an occasion for the Church to clarify some frequent misconceptions concerning human dignity and to address some serious and urgent related issues. So there we get the sort of the purpose of this document, right? There's a occasion where we can clear up some misconceptions. Number 3. From the start of her mission and propelled by the gospel, the Church has striven to affirm human freedom and promote the rights of all people. In recent times, thanks to the voices of the pontiffs, the Church has made a deliberate effort to formulate this commitment in more explicit terms through a renewed call to acknowledge the fundamental dignity inherent in every person. On this point, Pope St. Paul VI affirmed that, quote, no anthropology equals that of the Church regarding the human person, particularly concerning the person's originality, dignity, the intangibility and richness of the person's fundamental rights, sacredness, capacity for education, aspiration to a complete development, and immortality. Beautiful. Chapter 4. Pope St. John Paul II, during the Third General Conference of Latin American and Caribbean Bishops in Puebla in 1979, affirmed that human dignity is, quote, a gospel value that cannot be despised without greatly offending the Creator. This dignity is infringed on the individual level when due regard is not had for values such as freedom, the right to profess one's religion, physical and mental integrity, the right to essential goods, to life. It is infringed on the social and political level when man cannot exercise his right of participation, or when he is subjected to unjust and unlawful coercion, or submitted to physical or mental torture, etc. If the Church makes herself present in the defense of or in the advancement of human dignity, she does so in line with her mission, which, although it is religious and not social or political, cannot fail to consider man in the entirety of his being. Chapter 5. Then, in 2010, addressing the Pontifical Academy for Life, Pope Benedict XIV declared that human dignity is a fundamental principle which faith in the crucified and risen Jesus Christ has always defended, especially when, in respect of the simplest and most defenseless people, it is disregarded. On another occasion, speaking to economists, he stated that, quote, the economy and finance do not exist for their own sake. They are only an instrument or means. Their sole end is the human person and his or her total fulfillment and dignity. This is the only capital, and it is right to safeguard it. Chapter 6. From the start of his pontificate, Pope Francis has invited the Church to, quote, believe in a Father who loves all men and women with an infinite love, realizing that, quote, he thereby confers upon them an infinite dignity. So, obviously, what I'm getting so far is, at this point, it's just kind of extrapolating on the importance of dignity. He has strongly emphasized that such immense dignity is an original datum, something given, that is to be acknowledged faithfully and welcomed with gratitude. Based on this recognition and acceptance of human dignity, a new coexistence among people can be established that develops social relationships in the context of authentic fraternity. Indeed, only by, quote, acknowledging the dignity of each human person, end quote, can we, quote, contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity, end quote. Pope Francis affirms that, quote, the wellspring of human dignity and fraternity is in the gospel of Jesus Christ, end quote. But even human reason can arrive at this conviction through reflection and dialogue, since, quote, the dignity of others is to be respected in all circumstances, not because that dignity is something we have invented or imagined, but because human beings possess an intrinsic worth superior to that of material objects and contingent situations. This requires that they be treated differently. That every human being possesses an inalienable dignity is a truth that corresponds to human nature apart from all cultural change. Now, to me, that's a very objective statement, right? That doesn't sound relativistic at all to me. That last point, that every human being possesses an inalienable dignity, is a truth that corresponds to human nature apart from all cultural change. Pope Francis concludes, human beings have the same inviolable dignity in every age of history, and no one can consider himself or herself authorized by particular situations to deny this conviction or to act against it. From this perspective, Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti constitutes a kind of Magna Carta of our contemporary tasks to protect and to promote human dignity. Now, let's go through the fundamental clarification. It is a fundamental clarification, so I'm assuming it's important. Chapter 7. There is a widespread agreement today on the importance and normative scope of human dignity and on the unique and transcendent value of every human being. However, the phrase, the dignity of the human person, risks lending itself to a variety of interpretations that can yield potential ambiguities and contradictions that lead us to wonder whether the equal dignity of all human beings is truly recognized, respected, protected, and promoted in every situation. This brings us to recognize the possibility of a fourfold distinction of the concept of dignity. Okay, so before I go on, I haven't read this before the time. I haven't thought out what I was going to say because I just wanted to read this. And I love the fact that they're going to address ambiguities now, right? Let's point out where there might be points that are not clear, and let's address them. Let's see how they do it. Ontological dignity, and we're going through the fourfold distinctions here. Ontological dignity, moral dignity, social dignity, and existential dignity. The most important among these is the ontological dignity that belongs to the person as such, simply because he or she exists and is willed, created, and loved by God. Wow, that's power. Thank God. Ontological dignity is indelible and remains valid beyond any circumstances in which the person may find themselves. When we speak of moral dignity, we refer to how people exercise their freedom. While people are endowed with conscience, they can always act against it. However, were they to do so, they would behave in a way that is, quote, not dignified, with respect to their nature as creatures who are loved by God and called to love others. Yet, this possibility always exists for human freedom, and history illustrates how individuals, when exercising their freedom against the law of love revealed by the gospel, can commit inestimably profound acts of evil against others. Those who act this way seem to have lost any trace of humanity and dignity. This is where the present distinction can help us discern between the moral dignity that de facto, by the fact, can be lost, and the ontological dignity that can never be lost, can never be annulled. And it is precisely because of this latter point that we must work with all our might so that all those who have done evil may repent and convert. I'm going to read that last line again. Well, I'll just maybe explain it how I understand it. Essentially, there's a distinction between moral dignity and ontological dignity. We can choose to lose our moral dignity in moments when we do something undignified, but your ontological dignity is as a consequence of you being loved, willed, and created by God. So that's not something that's possible for you to lose. And it's because of the latter point that we have to work with all our might so that those who have done evil will repent and convert, because they can actually lose that moral dignity, as I understand it. Which, I mean, obviously, yeah, that's true. Number 8, there are still two other possible aspects of dignity to consider: social and existential. When we speak of social dignity, we refer to the quality of a person's living conditions. For example, in cases of extreme poverty, where individuals do not even have what is minimally necessary to live according to their ontological dignity, it is said that these poor people are living in an undignified manner. This expression does not imply a judgment on those individuals, but highlights how the situation in which they are forced to live contradicts their inalienable dignity. The last meaning is that of existential dignity, which is the type of dignity implied in the ever-increasing discussion about a dignified life and one that is not dignified. For instance, while some people may appear to lack nothing essential for life, for various reasons, they may still struggle to live with peace, joy, and hope. In other situations, the presence of serious illnesses, violent family environments, pathological addictions, and other hardships may drive people to experience their life conditions as, quote, undignified, vis-a-vis their perception of that ontological dignity that can never be obscured. These distinctions remind us of the inalienable value of the ontological dignity that is rooted in the very being of the human person in all circumstances. Number 9. Finally, it is worth mentioning that the classical definition of a person as an, quote, individual substance of rational nature, of a rational nature, end quote, clarifies the foundation of human dignity. As an individual substance, the person possesses ontological dignity. That is, at the metaphysical level of being itself, having received existence from God, humans are subjects who subsist. That is, they exercise their existence autonomously. The term rational encompasses all the capacities of the human person, including the capacities of knowing and understanding, as well as those of wanting, loving, choosing, and desiring. It also includes all corporeal functions closely related to these abilities. Nature refers to the conditions particular to us as human beings, which enable our various operations and the experiences that characterize them. In this sense, nature is the principle of action. We do not create our nature. We hold it as a gift, and we can nurture, develop, and enhance our abilities. By exercising the freedom to cultivate the riches of our nature, we grow over time. I will read that again. By exercising the freedom to cultivate the riches of our nature, we grow over time. Even if a person is unable to exercise these capabilities due to various limitations or conditions, nevertheless, the person always subsists as an individual substance with a complete and inalienable dignity. This applies, for instance, to an unborn child, an unconscious person, or an older person in distress. This complete and inalienable dignity applies to an unborn child, an unconscious person, and an older person in distress. So a few points being hit there, right? Now, another point is a growing awareness of the centrality of human dignity. Chapter 10. Already in classical antiquity, an intuition about human dignity emerged from a social perspective that viewed each person as invested with a particular dignity based on their rank and status within an established order. From its origins in the social sphere, the word dignity then was used to describe the differentiated dignity of beings in the cosmos. In this view, all beings possess their own dignity, according to their place within the harmony of the whole. Some high points of ancient thought did begin to acknowledge a unique place for humans as beings endowed with reason, able to take responsibility for themselves and others in the world. Nevertheless, a way of thinking that would be able to ground our respect for the dignity of every human person in every circumstance was still a long way away. Now let's explore some biblical perspectives. Chapter 11. By the way, I'm actually really enjoying reading this. It's nice to just go to the source document myself and sit and read through it and see what it actually says. I think I'm going to do this more often. Biblical revelation teaches that all human beings possess inherent dignity because they are created in the image and likeness of God. God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. With this, humanity has a specific quality that means it is not reducible to purely material elements. Moreover, the image does not define the soul or its intellectual abilities, but the dignity of man and woman. In their relationship of equality and mutual love, both the man and the woman represent God in the world and are also called to cherish and nurture the world. Because of this, to be created in the image of God means to possess a sacred value that transcends every distinction of a sexual, social, political, cultural, and religious nature. Our dignity is bestowed upon us by God. It is neither claimed nor deserved. Every human being is loved and willed by God and thus has an inviolable dignity. In Exodus, at the heart of the Old Testament, God shows himself to be one who hears the cry of the poor, sees the misery of his people, and cares for those who are least and for the oppressed. The same teaching can be found in the Deuteronomic Code. Here, the teaching on rights is transformed into a manifesto of human dignity, particularly in favor of the threefold category of the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. The ancient precepts of Exodus are recalled and applied to the moment in the preaching of the prophets, who represent the critical conscience of Israel. The prophets Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, and Jeremiah have entire chapters denouncing injustice. Amos bitterly decries the oppression of the poor, and his listeners fail to recognize any fundamental human dignity in the destitute. Isaiah pronounces a curse against those who trample on the rights of the poor, denying them all justice. Quote, "Woe to those who decree iniquitous decrees, and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice." This prophetic teaching is echoed in wisdom literature. For example, Sirach equates the oppression of the poor with murder. Quote, "To take away a neighbor's living is to murder him. To deprive an employee of his wages is to shed blood." End quote. In the Psalms, the religious relationship with God comes through the defense of the weak and needy. Quote, "Do justice for the weak and the orphan, give justice to the poor and afflicted, rescue the weak and the needy, set them free from the hand of the wicked." Chapter 12. Born and raised in humble conditions, Jesus reveals the dignity of the needy and those who labor. Then, throughout his public ministry, he affirms the value of dignity and dignity of all who bear the image of God, regardless of their social status and external circumstances. Jesus broke down cultural and cultic barriers, restoring dignity to those who were rejected or were considered to be on the margins of society, such as tax collectors, women, children, lepers, the sick, strangers, and widows. He heals, feeds, defends, liberates, and saves. He is described as a shepherd who is concerned about the one sheep that was lost. He identifies with the least of his brethren. "As you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me." In biblical language, the little ones are not only the children, but also the vulnerable, the most insignificant, the outcast, the oppressed, the discarded, the poor, the marginalized, the unlearned, the sick, and those who are downtrodden by the powerful. The glorious Christ will judge by the love of neighbor that consists in ministering to the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and the imprisoned with whom he identifies. For Jesus, the good done to every human being, regardless of the ties of blood or religion, is the single criterion of judgment. The Apostle Paul affirms that every Christian must live according to the requirements of dignity and respect for the rights of all people, according to the new commandment of love. Okay, so I want to have a quick look here at... Sorry guys, I just want to have a quick look Okay, hey guys. Hey Gabriel. Hey Father John. Welcome. Hello Cam. Thanks so much for being here, guys. It's nice to know I've got a few people here with me as I go through this. Great. So let's move on to the next point, the next sort of mini section here, which is developments in Christian thought and chapter 13. As Christian thought developed, it also prompted and accompanied the progress of humanity's reflection on the concept of dignity. Drawing from the rich traditions of the Church Fathers, classical Christian anthropology emphasized the doctrine of the human being as created in the image and likeness of God and the unique role of the human person in creation. By critically sifting through the inheritance it had received from ancient philosophy, medieval Christian thought arrived at a synthesis of the notion of the person that recognized the metaphysical foundation of human dignity. St. Thomas Aquinas attested to this when he affirmed that person signifies what is most perfect in all nature, that is, a subsistent individual of a rational nature. The Christian humanism of the Renaissance later emphasized this ontological dignity and its preeminent manifestation in free human action. Even in the writings of such modern thinkers as Descartes and Kant, who challenged some of the foundations of traditional Christian anthropology, one can still strongly perceive echoes of revelation. That is such a beautiful line. I just want to read that again. Even in the writings of such modern thinkers as Descartes and Kant, who challenged some of the foundations of traditional Christian anthropology, one can still strongly perceive echoes of revelation. Building upon some recent philosophical reflections about the status of theoretical and practical subjectivity, Christian reflection then came to emphasize even more the depths of the concept of dignity. In the 20th century, this reached an original perspective, as seen in personalism, that recognized the question of subjectivity and expanded it to encompass intersubjectivity and the relationships that bind people together. The thinking flowing from this view has enriched contemporary Christian anthropology. So now we come to the present era, and there's no time like the present. This is chapter 14. Today the term dignity is mainly used to emphasize the uniqueness of the human person, incomparable to all other entities in the universe. From this perspective, we can understand how the word dignity was used in the 1948 United Nations Declaration, which speaks about quote, the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, end quote. Only this inalienable character of human dignity makes it possible to speak about human rights. That is such an important point that's easy to forget. I'll just read that again. Only this inalienable character of human dignity makes it possible to speak about human rights. What are the rights based on, if not based on the fact that human beings have dignity? 15 says, to clarify the concept of dignity even further, it is essential to point out that dignity is not something granted to the person by others based on their gifts or qualities, such that it could be withdrawn. Were it so bestowed, it would be given in a conditional and alienable way, and then the very meaning of dignity, however worthy of great respect, would remain exposed to the risk of being abolished. Instead, dignity is intrinsic to the person. It is not conferred subsequently, a posteriori. It is prior to any recognition, and it cannot be lost. All human beings possess the same intrinsic dignity, regardless of whether or not they can express it in a suitable manner. Wow, I love that. There's been a few lines already that have just kind of struck me as very beautiful. Very well written. Number 16. For this reason, the Second Vatican Council speaks of the sublime dignity of the human person who stands above all things and whose rights and duties are universal and inviolable. As the opening line of the Conciliar Declaration Dignitatis Humanae recalls, contemporary man is becoming increasingly conscious of the dignity of the human person, more and more people are demanding that men should exercise fully their own judgment and a responsible freedom in their actions, and should not be subject to the pressure or coercion, but be inspired by a sense of duty. Such freedom of thought and conscience, both individual and communal, is based on the recognition of human dignity, as known through the revealed word of God and by reason itself. The Church's magisterium progressively developed an ever greater understanding of the meaning of human dignity, along with its demands and consequences, until it arrived at the recognition that the dignity of every human being prevails beyond all circumstances. Now we come to point 2 of this area. The Church proclaims, promotes, and guarantees human dignity. Chapter 17. The Church proclaims the equal dignity of all people, regardless of their living conditions or qualities. This proclamation rests on a threefold conviction which, in the light of Christian faith, gives human dignity an immeasurable value and reinforces its intrinsic demands. The indelible image of God. Chapter 18, the first conviction, drawn from Revelation, holds that the dignity of the human person comes from the love of the Creator, who has imprinted the indelible features of his image on every person. The Creator calls each person to know him, to love him, and to live in a covenantal relationship with him, while calling the person also to live in fraternity, justice, and peace with all others. In this perspective, dignity refers not only to the soul, but also to the person as an inseparable unity of body and soul. Accordingly, dignity is also inherent in each person's body, which participates in its own way in being in imago Dei, which is Latin for in the image of God, and is also called to share in the soul's glory in the divine beatitude. Christ elevates human dignity. Chapter 19. The second conviction follows from the fact that the dignity of the human person was revealed in its fullness when the Father sent his Son, who assumed human existence to the full. Quote, "In the mystery of the Incarnation, the Son of God confirmed the dignity of the body and soul which constitute the human being." End quote. By uniting himself with every human being through his incarnation, Jesus Christ confirmed that each person possesses an immeasurable dignity simply by belonging to the human community. Moreover, he affirmed that this dignity can never be lost. By proclaiming that the kingdom of God belongs to the poor, the humble, the despised, and those who suffer in body and spirit, by healing all sorts of illnesses and infirmities, even the most dramatic ones, such as leprosy, by affirming that whatever is done to these individuals is also done to him because he is present in them. In all these ways, Jesus brought the great novelty of recognizing the dignity of every person, especially those who were considered, quote, unworthy. This new principle in human history, which emphasizes that individuals are even more worthy of our respect and love when they are weak, scorned, or suffering, even to the point of losing the human, quote, figure, has changed the face of the world. This is such an important point, right? This change that Christ brought about actually means that people are, in a sense, even more worthy of our respect and love, even when they're weak. And this is saying it's, this chapter is just pointing out this idea. This has just changed everything. It's changed literally the face of the world. Okay, not literally, but it's changed the face of the world. It has given life to institutions that take care of those who find themselves in disadvantaged conditions, such as abandoned infants, orphans, the elderly who are left without assistance, the mentally ill, people with incurable diseases or severe deformities, and those living on the streets. A vocation to the fullness of dignity. Chapter 20. The third conviction concerns the ultimate destiny of human beings. After the creation and the incarnation, Christ's resurrection reveals a further aspect of human dignity. Indeed, the dignity of man rests above all on the fact that he is called to communion with God, destined to last forever. Thus, the dignity of this life is linked not only to its beginning, to the fact that it comes from God, but also to its final end, to its destiny of fellowship with God in knowledge and love of Him. In the light of this truth, Saint Irenaeus qualifies and completes his praise of man. The glory of God is indeed man, living man, but the life of man consists in the vision of God. Chapter 21. Consequently, the Church believes and affirms that all human beings, created in the image and likeness of God, are recreated in the Son who became man, was crucified, and rose again, are called to grow under the action of the Holy Spirit, to reflect the glory of the Father in that same image, and to share in eternal life. Indeed, Revelation shows forth the dignity of the human person in all its fullness. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to skip a few points here, just because I think the document is going to effectively repeat itself a few points and just hammer home this point of dignity. So what I want to do now, and please forgive me if I'm skipping a part you really wanted me to read, but I want to move a little bit further down and talk about... Okay, here's one we can talk about. So we're starting off with poverty, and then we're going to go to war, and we'll see what the document says. We'll listen to the document from the horse's mouth, right? Whew, it's a lot of reading. At least I have this water here. Cam says, I'm glad for this document because the world has fallen into enabling self-harm rather than treating problems like mental illness. Yeah, I agree. Even though the world is going through difficult times, I sometimes still feel like we're in an age of decadence. And I think that's one of the reasons so many young people are looking to traditional forms of religion again, because they want something that isn't decadent and they want some discipline. And it's weird, this tendency for us to encourage evil. It's almost like the society becomes just increasingly decadent. And even if we're not decadent necessarily in how many groceries we can fit into our shopping cart due to inflation, maybe we're less decadent in areas like that, but we can still become more decadent in, I think, moral spheres, and we can permit things that are essentially, I keep using the word decadent, but we can permit moral evils in this spirit of decadence. So it might even be to the point where we are trying to encourage things that we think are good for people, but actually we are just, because it's a spirit of decadence, what we think is good for somebody is actually just destroying them. So it goes back to your point, Cam, which is that we're sort of enabling more and more self-harm instead of treating the issues. Okay, so let's continue with the drama of poverty. 36. One of the phenomena that contributes significantly to denying the dignity of so many human beings is extreme poverty, linked as it is to the unequal distribution of wealth. Now, let me just pause and say that I'm a South African and I live in South Africa, so I see extreme poverty. I see it. And South Africa has often been called one of the most unequally distributed countries on the planet, if not the most. So this to me isn't just words on a page. I know we all can intellectually understand, but we're not necessarily going through this, but we can all sort of imagine it. And then there's some of us who might be a little bit more distant from it, and we might have to use our imagination a little bit more. And then I think there's a lot of people in Africa who are living in it and seeing it every day. So it's no surprise to me that the church is growing in Africa. And it is. So let's continue. As Pope St. John Paul II emphasized, so we're right here, guys, in case you lost me, one of the greatest injustices in the contemporary world consists precisely in this, that the ones who possess much are relatively few, and those who possess almost nothing are many. It is the injustice of the poor distribution of the goods and services originally intended for all. Moreover, it would be misleading to make a cursory distinction between rich and poor countries. For Benedict XIV recognized that, quote, the world's wealth is growing in absolute terms, but inequalities are on the increase. In rich countries, new sectors of society are succumbing to poverty, and new forms of poverty are emerging. In poorer areas, some groups enjoy a sort of super development of a wasteful and consumerist kind, which forms an unacceptable contrast with the ongoing situations of dehumanizing deprivation. The, quote, scandal of glaring inequalities continues, where the dignity of the poor is doubly denied because of the lack of resources available to meet their basic needs and the indifference shown towards them by neighbors. Now, I think it's maybe useful at this point to realize that each and every one of us is reading this through a sort of framework or looking at this through a lens. And sometimes we might be looking at it in a lens that doesn't match the motive of the person who is writing it. So let me maybe elaborate a little bit and say that something I notice continually creating content on YouTube, which is really an American company, American platform. You know, majority of the viewers are Americans. I notice a lot there seems to be this lens and this dichotomy of left versus right, of liberal and conservative, and everything can sometimes be kind of clumsily divided into these two categories. And it might just be because I'm not from that mindset, although I'm familiar with it because I see it so much in the media, because so much of American media permeates world culture. So I understand it intellectually, but I just don't think in that way. So when the church says something that seems to be pro-environment, I don't immediately think of that as a left-wing point, and I don't see the church wanting to help people who are struggling with poverty, and I don't see the church acknowledging that resources could probably be distributed a little bit better. Not to say that we should just take those resources from people who are doing better and just give them to the poor. That's not what the church is saying. But just acknowledging the fact that maybe the glaring inequalities are a problem and there's something we should be doing about it. Someone needs to be saying that. We need that voice. And if not the church, if the world forgets that, if the world forgets the dignity of human beings, again, it goes right back to my initial point. If the world goes astray, the church will rebuke the world. But if the church stops saying this stuff and the world forgets the dignity of human beings, the world is not going to rebuke the church. So it might frustrate someone if they're looking at this through a very left-wing, right-wing dichotomy and they think, oh, well, the church is just saying things that sound like communism to me. I just don't think you're reading it clearly enough. I just don't think it's saying that. I think the church is just saying that inequalities are on the increase and there's just things we need to consider are kind of wasteful consumerist spending when there's human beings, again, who have dignity, who are literally dying in the streets. So it's just, I don't think it's helpful to look at everything through a left-right image. But I'm not trying to lecture anybody. I'm not trying to tell anybody how to view this. It's continually surprising to me how often things get divided like that, and I don't think it's helpful. Chapter number 37, sorry. Or did we finish that one? Yes, we did. 37 says, with Pope Francis, therefore, one must conclude that wealth has increased, but together with inequality, with the result that new forms of poverty are emerging. The claim that the modern world has reduced poverty is made by measuring poverty with criteria from the past that do not correspond to present-day realities. As a result, that's an interesting point. I don't really have thoughts on it right now. 60 says, as a result, poverty can take a variety of forms, such as an obsession with reducing labor costs and no concern for its grave consequences, since the unemployment that is directly generated leads to the expansion of poverty. Among these destructive effects of the empire of money, it must be recognized that there is no poverty worse than that which takes away work and the dignity of work. That is so true. Moreover, If some people are born into a country or family where they have fewer opportunities to develop, we should acknowledge that this is contrary to their dignity, which is the same dignity as that of those born into a wealthy family or country. We are all responsible for this stark inequality, albeit to varying degrees. Then we have war. 38. Another tragedy that denies human dignity, both in the past and today, is war. War, terrorist attacks, racial or religious persecution, and many other affronts to human dignity have become so common as to constitute a real Third World War fought piecemeal. With its trail of destruction and suffering, war attacks human dignity in both the short and long term. While reaffirming the inalienable right to self-defense and the responsibility to protect those whose lives are threatened, we must acknowledge that war is always a defeat of humanity. No war is worth the tears of a mother who has seen her child mutilated or killed. No war is worth the loss of the life of even one human being, a sacred being created in the image and likeness of the Creator. No war is worth the poisoning of our common home, and no war is worth the despair of those who are forced to leave their homeland and are deprived from one moment to the next of their home and all the family, friendship, social and cultural ties that have been built up, sometimes over generations. All wars, by the mere fact that they contradict human dignity, are conflicts that will not solve problems, but only increase them. This point is even more critical in our time, when it has become commonplace for so many innocent civilians to perish beyond the confines of a battlefield. Chapter 39. Therefore, even today, the Church cannot but make her own the words of the pontiffs, repeating the Pope Saint Paul VI, Jamais plus la guerre. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this. Jamais plus la guerre. Jamais plus la guerre. Never again war, never again war. I just butchered that one. Wow. Moreover, together with Pope St. John Paul II, the Church pleads, in the name of God and in the name of man, do not kill, do not prepare destruction and extermination for people. Think of your brothers and sisters who are suffering, hunger, and misery. Respect each other's dignity and freedom. As much now as ever, this is the cry of the Church and of all humanity. Pope Francis underscores this by stating, we can no longer think of war as a solution because its risks will probably always be greater than its supposed benefits. In view of this, it is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war. I know some people are not going to like that point. Since humanity often falls back into the same mistakes of the past, in order to make peace a reality, we must move away from the logic of the legitimacy of war. The intimate relationship between faith and human dignity means it would be contradictory for war to be based on religious convictions. Quote, the one who calls upon God's name to justify terrorism, violence, and war does not follow God's path. War in the name of religion becomes a war against religion itself. Next is the travel of migrants, which is, I think, so far the first time I'm hearing about migrants. I've been hearing in the news that all this document talks about is migrants. I don't know what's going to happen in the rest of the document, but it seems to me this is the first time it's being addressed directly. Chapter 40, migrants are among the first victims of multiple forms of poverty. Not only is their dignity denied in their home countries, but they also leave their lives. But also their lives are put at risk because they no longer have the means to start a family, to work, or to feed themselves. Once they have arrived in countries that should be able to accept them, migrants are not seen as entitled like others to participate in the life of society, and it is forgotten that they possess the same intrinsic dignity as any person. No one will ever openly deny that they are human beings, yet in practice, by our decisions and the way we treat them, we can show that we consider them less worthy, less important, less human. Therefore, it is urgent to remember that every migrant is a human person who, as such, possesses fundamental inalienable rights that must be respected by everyone and in every circumstance. receiving migrants is an important and meaningful way of defending, quote, the inalienable dignity of each human person, regardless of origin, race, or religion. Let's continue. By the way, guys, I'm not, again, like I said at the beginning, I'm not trying to address everything that's being said here, right? I'm just trying to read it and so that I can think about it. Human trafficking is number 41. And look, this is a huge problem, right? Human trafficking is one of those things that I don't think people really talk about that much, but it's heartbreaking. If you really look at the statistics and you really look at what's going on, it'll bring a tear to your eye, man. Human trafficking is something that's very prevalent in South Africa. It's something that I have to think about every time I go out with my family. It's a big problem. So I'm happy to see this. Human trafficking must also be counted among the grave violations of human dignity. While it is not a new phenomenon, it has taken on tragic dimensions before our eyes, which is why Pope Francis has denounced it in particularly emphatic terms. Quote, I reaffirm here that the trade in people is a vile activity, a disgrace to our societies that claim to be civilized. Exploiters and clients at all levels should make a serious examination of conscience, both in the first person and before God. Today, the Church is renewing her urgent appeal that the dignity and centrality of every individual always be safeguarded, with respect for fundamental rights, as her social teaching emphasizes. She asks that these rights really be extended for millions of men and women on every continent, wherever they are not recognized. In a world in which a lot is said about rights, how often is human dignity actually trampled upon? In a world in which so much is said about rights, it seems that the only thing that has any rights is money. 42. For these reasons, the Church and humanity must not cease fighting against such phenomena as, quote, the marketing of human organs and tissues, the sexual exploitation of boys and girls, slave labor, including prostitution, the drug and weapons trade, terrorism, and international organized crime. Such is the magnitude of these situations, and their toll in innocent lives, that we must avoid every temptation to fall into a declarationist nominalism that would assuage our consciences. We need to ensure that our institutions are truly effective in the struggle against all these scourges. Confronted with these varied and brutal denials of human dignity, we need to be increasingly aware that, quote, human trafficking is a crime against humanity. It essentially denies human dignity in at least two ways. Trafficking profoundly disfigures the humanity of the victim, offending his or her freedom and dignity, yet, at the same time, it dehumanizes those who carry it out. Powerful. Sexual abuse. 43. The profound dignity inherent in human beings in their entirety of mind and body also allows us to understand why all sexual abuse leaves deep scars in the hearts of those who suffer it. Indeed, those who suffer sexual abuse experience real wounds in their human dignity. These are sufferings that can last a lifetime and that no repentance can remedy. This phenomenon is widespread in society, and that also affects the Church and represents a serious obstacle to her mission. From this stems the Church's ceaseless efforts to put an end to all kinds of abuse, starting from within. Okay, we then have violence against women, which is chapter 44. Violence against women is a global scandal that is gaining increasing recognition. While the equal dignity of women may be recognized in words, the inequalities between women and men in some countries remain very serious. Even in the most developed and democratic countries, the concrete social reality testifies to the fact that women are often not accorded the same dignity as men. Pope Francis highlighted this when he affirmed that the organization of societies worldwide is still far from reflecting clearly that women possess the same dignity and identical rights as men. We say one thing with words, but our decisions and reality tell another story. Indeed, doubly poor are those women who endure situations of exclusion, mistreatment, and violence, since they are frequently less able to defend their rights. Chapter 45, Pope St. John Paul II recognized that, quote, much remains to be done to prevent discrimination against those who have chosen to be wives and mothers. There is an urgent need to achieve real equality in every area: equal pay for equal work, protection for working mothers, fairness in career advancements, equality of spouses with regard to family rights, and the recognition of everything that is part of the rights and duties of citizens in a democratic state. Indeed, inequalities in these areas are also various forms of violence. He also recalled that the time has come to condemn vigorously the types of sexual violence which frequently have women for their object, and to pass laws which effectively defend them from such violence. Nor can we fail, in the name of the respect due to the human person, to condemn the widespread hedonistic and commercial culture which encourages the systematic exploitation of sexuality and corrupts even very young girls into letting their bodies be used for profit. Among the forms of violence carried out on women, how can we not mention coercive abortions, which affect both mother and child, often to satisfy the selfishness of males? And how can we not also mention the practice of polygamy? As the Catechism of the Catholic Church reminds us, polygamy is contrary to the equal dignity of women and men. It is also contrary to conjugal love, which is undivided and exclusive. Amen. Chapter 46. In this consideration of violence against women, one cannot condemn enough the phenomenon of femicide. On this front, the entire international community must have a coordinated and concrete commitment, as Pope Francis reiterated. Our love for Mary must help us to feel appreciation and gratitude for women, for our mothers and grandmothers, who are a bastion in the life in our cities. Almost always in silence, they carry life forward. It is the silence and strength of hope. Thank you for your witness. But in thinking of our mothers and grandmothers, I want to invite you to combat a scourge that affects our American continent, the numerous cases where women are killed, and the many situations of violence that are kept quiet behind so many walls. I ask you to fight against this source of suffering by calling for legislation and a culture that repudiates every form of violence. Okay, so now we get to the abortion point. I'm enjoying this read so far. It's interesting. Okay, good. So, let's continue with the next chapter. We're more than halfway. I think we have about 13, 19 chapters left. So, a nice, calm, easy, non-controversial topic. Chapter 47. The Church consistently reminds us that, quote, the dignity of every human being has an intrinsic character and is valid from the moment of conception until natural death. It is precisely the affirmation of such dignity that is the inalienable prerequisite for the protection of a personal and social existence, and also the necessary condition for fraternity and social friendship to be realized among all the peoples of the earth. On account of the intangible value of human life, the Church's magisterium has always spoken out against abortion. In this regard, Pope St. John Paul II writes, quote, among all the crimes which can be committed against life, procured abortion has characteristics making it particularly serious and deplorable. But today, in many people's consciences, the perception of its gravity has become progressively obscured. The acceptance of abortion in the popular mind, in behavior, and even in law itself, is a telling sign of an extremely dangerous crisis of the moral sense, which is becoming more and more incapable of distinguishing between good and evil, even when the fundamental right to life is at stake. Given such a grave situation, We need now more than ever to have the courage to look the truth in the eye and to call things by their proper name, without yielding to convenient compromises or to the temptation of self-deception. In this regard, the reproach of the prophet is extremely straightforward. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness. Especially in the case of abortion, there is a widespread use of ambiguous terminology, such as, quote, interruption of pregnancy, which tends to hide abortion's true nature and to attenuate its seriousness in public opinion. Perhaps this linguistic phenomenon is itself a symptom of an uneasiness of conscience. Okay, so that's, again, one of these great points I'd like to just read again. This tendency to clean up the language so things don't sound as shocking, right? It's saying here that perhaps this is actually a consequence of an uneasiness of conscience, right? We feel this guilt, so we can't say things, we can't say what's actually happening. And so all these new words have kind of emerged within society all these new terms or concepts have kind of emerged to try and reduce the horror of what's actually going on. Let's continue. But no word has the power to change the reality of things. Procured abortion is the deliberate and direct killing, by whatever means it is carried out, of a human being in the initial phase of his or her existence, extending from conception to birth. Unborn children are, thus, the most defenseless and innocent among us. Nowadays, efforts are made to deny them their human dignity, and to do with them whatever one pleases, taking their lives and passing laws preventing anyone from standing in the way of this. It must therefore be stated with all force and clarity, even in our time, that this defense of unborn life is closely linked to the defense of each and every other human right. It involves the conviction that a human being is always sacred and inviolable. In any situation and at every stage of development, human beings are ends in themselves and never a means of resolving other problems. Once this conviction disappears, so do solid and lasting foundations for the defense of human rights, which would always be subject to the passing whims of the powers that be. Reason alone is sufficient to recognize the inviolable value of each single human life. But if we also look at the issue from the standpoint of faith, every violation of the personal dignity of the human being cries out in vengeance to God and is an offense against the creator of the individual. In this context, it is worth recalling Saint Teresa of Calcutta's generous and courageous commitment to the defense of every person conceived. Now we come to the topic of surrogacy, which was something slightly newer being addressed. So I haven't read this myself. Let's go through it and read it again from the source. Chapter 48. The Church also takes a stand against the practice of surrogacy, through which the immensely worthy child becomes a mere object. On this point, Pope Francis's words have a singular clarity. Quote, the path to peace calls for respect for life, for every human life, starting with the life of the unborn child in the mother's womb, which cannot be suppressed or turned into an object of trafficking. In this regard, I deem deplorable the practice of so-called surrogate motherhood, which represents a grave violation of the dignity of the woman and the child, based on the exploitation of situations of the mother's material needs. A child is always a gift and never the basis of a commercial contract. Consequently, I express my hope for an effort by the international community to prohibit this practice universally. That voice has got to be there. The Church has got to be there. Someone's got to be saying it. 49. First and foremost, the practice of surrogacy violates the dignity of the child. Indeed, every child possesses an intangible dignity that is clearly expressed, albeit in a unique and differentiated way, at every stage of his or her life, from the moment of conception, at birth, growing up as a boy or girl, and becoming an adult. Because of this unalienable dignity, the child has the right to have a fully human and not artificially induced origin, and to receive the gift of a life that manifests both the dignity of the giver and that of the receiver. Moreover, acknowledging the dignity of the human person also entails recognizing every dimension of the dignity of the conjugal union and of human procreation. Considering this, the legitimate desire to have a child, which is a legitimate desire, that legitimate desire cannot be transformed into a, quote, right to a child that fails to respect the dignity of that child as the recipient of the gift of life. Chapter 50, surrogacy also violates the dignity of the woman, whether she is coerced into it or chooses to subject herself to it freely. For in this practice, the woman is detached from the child growing in her and becomes a mere means subservient to the arbitrary gain or desire of others. This contrasts in every way with the fundamental dignity of every human being and with each person's right to be recognized always individually and never as an instrument for another. Great. So now we come to another non-controversial topic, euthanasia and assisted suicide. So let's go through these and see what the church says. I'm, as I keep saying, enjoying this quite a lot. Chapter 51. There is a special case of human dignity violation that is quieter, but is swiftly gaining ground. So, some people might say, well, why is the church, saying a lot of these things that the church has already said and that the church has said for many years? But, on this point, you have this violation that's gaining ground, and so it makes sense for the church to kind of try and create a bulwark against it, right? So it makes sense for certain points to come up again and again. I don't think that's a completely, I don't think that criticism is totally fair. I think some topics are going to come up again and again, because, if you just look at what's happening now in the media, this is all being talked about. And yes, maybe the church has held a certain stance for a while, but the person listening to that news or reading this document might not have been exposed to it prior. So let's continue with chapter 51. There is a special case of human dignity violation that is quieter but is swiftly gaining ground. It is unique in how it utilizes a mistaken understanding of human dignity to turn the concept of dignity against life itself. This is such a well-written line. It is unique in how it uses a misunderstanding of what human dignity means, and it then uses that misunderstanding of human dignity to do something that's against human dignity. This confusion is particularly evident today in discussions surrounding euthanasia. For example, laws permitting euthanasia or assisted suicide are sometimes called death with dignity acts. With this, there is a widespread notion that euthanasia or assisted suicide is somehow consistent with respect for the dignity of the human person. However, in response to this, it must be strongly reiterated that suffering does not cause the sick to lose their dignity, which is intrinsically and inalienably their own. Instead, suffering can become an opportunity to strengthen the bonds of mutual belonging and gain greater awareness of the precious value of each person to the whole human family. Certainly, this is chapter 52, certainly the dignity of those who are critically or terminally ill calls for all suitable and necessary efforts to alleviate their suffering through appropriate palliative care and by avoiding aggressive treatments or disproportionate medical procedures. This approach corresponds with the enduring responsibility to appreciate the needs of the sick person, care needs, pain relief, and affective and spiritual needs. However, an effort of this nature is entirely different from, and is indeed contrary to, a decision to end one's own life or that of another person who is burdened by suffering. Even in its sorrowful state, human life carries a dignity that must always be upheld, that can never be lost, and that calls for unconditional respect. Indeed, there are no circumstances under which a human life would cease from being dignified and could as a result be put to an end. Each life has the same value and dignity for everyone. The respect of the life of another is the same as the respect owed to one's own life. Therefore, helping the suicidal person to take his or her own life is an objective offense against the dignity of the person asking for it, even if one would thereby be fulfilling the person's wish. We must accompany people towards death, but not provoke death or facilitate any form of suicide. Remember that the right to care and treatment for all must be prioritized so that the weakest, particularly the elderly and the sick, are never rejected. Life is a right, not death, which must be welcomed, not administered. Oh, that's a beautiful line. That's gorgeous. Life is a right, not death, which must be welcomed, not administered. Death should be welcomed, not administered. I don't know why, I just love that line. And this ethical principle concerns everyone, not just Christians or believers. As mentioned above, the dignity of each person, no matter how weak or burdened by suffering, implies the dignity of us all. The marginalization of people with disabilities. This is going to be chapter 53-54. Remember I said that this whole document has about 66 chapters, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to push through. I'm going to read this whole thing. I did skip a few sections earlier, but I do believe I got the gist of that. But I'm pretty much, if you stuck with me from the beginning, we've pretty much gone through this whole document so far. So let's continue. Chapter 53. One criterion for verifying whether real attention is given to the dignity of every individual in society is the help given to the most disadvantaged. Regrettably, our time is not known for such care. Rather, a throwaway culture is increasingly imposing itself to counter this trend. The condition of those experiencing physical or mental limitations warrants special attention and concern. Such conditions of acute vulnerability, which features prominently in the Gospels, prompt universal questions about what it means to be a human person, especially starting from the condition of impairment or disability. The question of human imperfection also carries clear socio-cultural implications, since some cultures tend to marginalize or even oppress individuals with disabilities, treating them as rejects. However, the truth is that every human being, each human being, regardless of their vulnerabilities, receives his or her dignity from the sole fact of being willed and loved by God. Thus, every effort should be made to encourage the inclusion and active participation of those who are affected by frailty or disability in the life of society and of the church. Chapter 54. In a broader perspective, it must be remembered that, quote, this charity, which is the spiritual heart of politics, is always a preferential love shown to those in greatest need. It undergirds everything we do on their behalf. To tend those in need takes strength and tenderness, effort and generosity in the midst of a functionalistic and privatized mindset that inexorably leads to a throwaway culture. It involves taking responsibility for the present with its situations of utter marginalization and anguish, and being capable of bestowing dignity upon it. It will likewise inspire intense effort to ensure that, quote, everything be done to protect the status and dignity of the human person. Now, this is the one that you're hearing a lot about in the news, which is the gender theory point. So I was actually curious to see what the document actually says. So let's go through it in a moment. Chapter 55. The Church wishes, first of all, to reaffirm that every person, regardless of sexual orientation, ought to be respected in his or her dignity and treated with consideration, while every sign of unjust discrimination is to be carefully avoided, particularly any form of aggression and violence. I think if you were just to take out that part and just read that or just see a quotation of that, you might think, why is this kind of disclaimer of dignity being added right before this point? Why do they have to cushion what they're about to say? But honestly, now, having read this whole document, it seems like they've pretty much done that in almost every chapter, where they continually say it must be re-emphasized that every human being has dignity. I mean, they do this when they talk about abortion. They do it when they talk about the treatment of those in poverty. So it's not really standing out to me now as strange that they added this, what seems maybe like a disclaimer, because actually they've been doing that this whole document. And I think that's something you might miss if you don't actually read it. Then it says, we are, just so you know, so you're not, you're not lost. I am over here. For this reason, it should be denounced as contrary to human dignity the fact that in some places, not a few people are imprisoned, tortured, and even deprived of the good of life. And here's the key word: solely because of their sexual orientation. Not because they've necessarily done something, but simply because of their orientation. In some cases, not just a few people, but many have been tortured, are being tortured, imprisoned, and deprived of the good of life. You might not experience that in your country, but take it from somebody born in Africa. It happens. And a lot of the time, I think when the church is writing a point to bishops and saying, you shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't do that, or you shouldn't do this, and you should allow this, and you should allow this, I think sometimes the church is addressing a problem in a specific area, in a specific continent, in a specific country. So when I see the church saying that, we shouldn't discriminate against people based solely on their orientation, I don't necessarily think they're speaking to developed first world countries. I think they're speaking to countries like mine, where people are, South Africa's not that bad, but, you get countries up north where you can get into a lot of trouble just for your orientation, whatever that might be. I mean, again, that's a whole other deeper can of worms. For now, I'll keep my focus and just continue with the document. 56 says, at the same time, the church highlights the definite critical issues present in gender theory. On this point, Pope Francis has reminded us that, quote, the path to peace calls for respect of human rights, in accordance with the simple yet clear formulation contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary was recently celebrated. These principles are self-evident and commonly accepted. Regrettably, in recent decades, attempts have been made to introduce new rights that are neither fully consistent with those originally defined, nor always acceptable. They have led to instances of ideological colonization, in which gender theory plays a central role. The latter is extremely dangerous, since it cancels differences in its claim to make everyone equal. 57. Regarding gender theory, whose scientific coherence is the subject of considerable debate among experts, the Church recalls that human life in all its dimensions, both physical and spiritual, is a gift from God. This gift is to be accepted with gratitude and placed at the service of the good. Desiring a personal self-determination, as gender theory prescribes, apart from this fundamental truth that human life is a gift, amounts to a concession to the age-old temptation to make oneself God, entering into competition with the true God of love revealed to us in the gospel. I'll allow myself to be a little bit Gen Z and just say supremely based. 58. Another prominent aspect of gender theory is that it intends to deny the greatest possible difference that exists between living beings. Sexual difference. That's a great line, actually. it tries, or it denies the greatest possible difference that exists between living beings, which is the sexual difference. This foundational difference is not only the greatest imaginable difference, but it is also the most beautiful and most powerful of them. In the male-female couple, this difference achieves the most marvelous of reciprocities. It thus becomes the source of that miracle that never ceases to surprise us, the arrival of new human beings in the world. 59. In this sense, respect for both one's own body and that of others is crucial in light of the proliferation of claims to new rights advanced by gender theory. This ideology, quote, envisages a society without sexual differences, thereby eliminating the anthropological basis of the family. It thus becomes unacceptable that some ideologies of this sort, which seek to respond to what are at times understandable aspirations, manage to assert themselves as absolute and unquestionable, even dictating how children should be raised. It needs to be emphasized that biological sex and the socio-cultural role of sex, i.e. gender, can be distinguished but not separated. Oof. Got to read that one again. It needs to be emphasized that the biological sex and the socio-cultural role of sex, i.e. gender, can be distinguished but not separated. Therefore, all attempts to obscure reference to the ineliminable sexual difference between man and woman are to be rejected. We cannot separate the masculine and the feminine from God's work of creation, which is prior to all our decisions and experiences, and where biological elements exist which are impossible to ignore, only by acknowledging accepting this difference in reciprocity can each person fully discover themselves, their identity, and their dignity and their identity. Chapter 60, we've got 6 left, guys. Holy cow. Before I read this chapter, I just want to check if the stream is still running. Great. I've got a few messages here in the chat. Thanks, Kaladin, for jumping on. Cam says the mask of caring has been used all too often to justify atrocity. Oh, absolutely. You know that expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? You've got to watch out for the goody-goodies, the people that want to fix everything and help everybody. Sometimes the motivations for that are a lot worse than we think, and sometimes those good intentions really just pave the way to a much worse outcome. Gabriel, I love your point here. He says, this section, I don't know exactly which section you're talking about, but you say, this section of the document reminds me of Chesterton. Because Chesterton said, it is the only thing, the church, the Catholic Church, the only thing that talks as if it were the truth. As if it were a real messenger, refusing to tamper with a real message. Yes, exactly. It's one of the things I love about being Catholic, is like the church talks with this authority. Like, you know, we have the truth. This is the truth, like it or not. And we are not going to mess with this message. We don't have the authority to change the teachings of the church. We the church, don't have the authority to change the teachings, the dogmas. So there's this real objectivity to things, that things are, in a sense, untouchable by us. These spiritual realities are untouchable by us. We can light the candles and say the words, but there are realities above you and me, and the church is just trying to align humanity with that as best we can, so that we can help humanity, so that humanity can find salvation. So I really appreciate that, Gabriel, that you said that, because I agree. This document, that section you were talking about, now I'm not sure exactly which section it was, but I've gotten that feeling reading this. You know, you get this sense you're reading a real the church is really speaking as a messenger of truth. We don't want to mess or tamper with this message. We just want to give it to you. Great. So let's talk about the next section, which is sex changes, chapter 60. The dignity of the body cannot be considered inferior to that of the person as such. The Catechism of the Catholic Church expressly invites us to recognize that, quote, the human body shares in the dignity of the image of God. Such a truth deserves to be remembered, especially when it comes to sex change, for humans are inseparably composed of both body and soul. In this, the body serves as the living context in which the interiority of the soul unfolds and manifests itself, as it does also through the network of human relationships. That is so beautifully written that I'm not going to keep going on about it because I'll just keep reading it over and over, but it's beautifully written. I love the way that was explained, the relationship between the body and the soul. So you guys know where we are. Constituting the person's being, the soul and the body both participate in the dignity that characterizes every human. Moreover, the body participates in that dignity, and as it is endowed with personal meanings, particularly in its sexed condition, it is in the body that each person recognizes himself or herself as generated by others. And okay, let me finish this point. It is in the body that each person recognizes himself or herself as generated by others, and that is through their bodies that men and women can establish a loving relationship capable of generating other persons. So just before I go on, this reminds me of something that is talked about in the theology of the body, which is that the very idea of genitals, it's related to the idea of generation, which is related to gender, which is genesis. So they all have this root, there's this relationship between our bodies and the generation of new life. And that's actually related to the idea of gender. You can just see, just on a purely etymological reading. In other words, if you just look at the meaning of the words and the root meanings of these words, you see this network of connections between the idea of generating new life and our sex. Then we continue with the blue, teaching about the need to respect the natural order of the human person. Pope Francis affirmed that, quote, creation is prior to us and must be received as a gift. At the same time, we are called to protect our humanity, and this means, in the first place, accepting it and respecting it as it was created. It follows that any sex change intervention, as a rule, risks threatening the unique dignity the person has received from the moment of conception. This is not to exclude the possibility that a person with genital abnormalities that are already evident at birth or that develop later may choose to receive the assistance of healthcare professionals to resolve these abnormalities. However, in this case, such a medical procedure would not constitute a sex change in the sense intended here. Great. So actually, guys, I see we are pretty much at the end. Let's read digital violence. 61. Although the advancement of digital technologies may offer many possibilities for promoting human dignity, it also increasingly tends towards the creation of a world in which exploitation, unfortunately, exclusion and violence grow, extending even to the point of harming the dignity of the human person. Consider, for example, how easy it is through these means to endanger a person's good name with fake news and slander. On this point, Pope Francis stresses that it is not healthy to confuse communication with mere virtual contact. Indeed, the digital environment is also one of loneliness, manipulation, exploitation, and violence, even to the extreme case of the dark web. Digital media can expose people to the risk of addiction, isolation, and gradual loss of contact with concrete reality, blocking the development of authentic interpersonal relationships. In other words, if you don't touch grass enough, eventually you can become isolated and addicted and pretty much stop being who you used to be, lose that social dynamic. And if you lose the social dynamic of who you are, you lose pretty much who you are. because we are social. New forms of violence are spreading through social media. For example, cyberbullying. The internet is also a channel for spreading pornography and the exploitation of persons through sexual purposes or through gambling. In this way, paradoxically, the more that opportunities for making connections grow in this realm, the more people find themselves isolated and impoverished in interpersonal relationships. Digital communication wants to bring everything out into the open. People's lives are combed over, laid bare and bandied about, often anonymously. Respect for others disintegrates, and even as we dismiss, ignore, or keep others distant, we can shamelessly peer into every detail of their lives. Oh, this is such a great point, right? We keep people distant. We can dismiss them, we can ignore them, and yet at the same time, because of social media, we shamelessly look at every detail of these people that we've dismissed and we've distanced ourselves from. That's a great point. Such tendencies represent a dark side of digital progress. Chapter 62. In this perspective, if technology is to serve human dignity and not harm it, and if it is to promote peace rather than violence, then the human community must be proactive in addressing these trends with respect to human dignity and the promotion of the good. In today's globalized world, the media can help us to feel closer to one another, creating a sense of the unity of the human family, which in turn can inspire solidarity and serious efforts to ensure a more dignified life for all. The media can help us greatly in this, especially nowadays, when the networks of human communication have made unprecedented advances. The internet, in particular, offers immense possibilities for encounter and solidarity. Thus, this is something truly good, a gift from God. We need constantly to ensure that present-day forms of communication are in fact guiding us to generous encounter with others, to honest pursuit of the whole truth, to service, to closeness, to the underprivileged, and to the promotion of the common good. And I see now we have reached the conclusion, the final 4 chapters. I have just about hit the end of my water, so we're right on time. Chapter 63. On the 75th anniversary of the promulgation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, Pope Francis reaffirmed that this document is like a master plan from which many steps have been taken, but many still need to be made, and unfortunately at times steps backwards have been taken. The commitment to human rights is never finished. In this regard, I am near to all those who, without fanfare in concrete daily life, fight and personally pay the price for defending the rights of those who do not count. 64. In this spirit, the Church, with the present declaration, ardently urges that respect for the dignity of the human person beyond all circumstances be placed at the center of the commitment to the common good and at the center of every legal system. Indeed, respect for the dignity of each person is the indispensable basis for the existence of any society that claims to be founded on just law and not on the force of power. Acknowledging human dignity forms the basis for upholding fundamental human rights which precede and ground all civic coexistence. Chapter 65, the penultimate chapter. Each individual, and also every human community, is responsible for the concrete and actual realization of human dignity. Meanwhile, it is incumbent on states not only to protect human dignity, but also to guarantee the conditions necessary for it to flourish in the internal promotion of the human person. In political activity, we should remember that appearances notwithstanding, every person is immensely holy and deserves our love and dedication. Chapter 66. Even today, in the face of so many violations of human dignity that seriously threaten the future of the human family, the Church encourages the promotion of the dignity of every human person, regardless of their physical, mental, cultural, social, and religious characteristics. The Church does this with hope, confident of the power that flows from the risen Christ, who has fully revealed the integral dignity of every man and woman. This certainly becomes an appeal in Pope Francis's words directed to each of us. Quote, I appeal to everyone throughout the world not to forget this dignity which is ours. No one has the right to take it from us. The Supreme Pontiff Francis, at the audience granted to the undersigned prefect of the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, with the secretary for the doctrinal section of that dicastery on 25 March 2024, approved this declaration, which was decided at the ordinary session of this dicastery on 28 February 2024, and he ordered its publication. Given in Rome at the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith on 2 April 2024, the 19th anniversary of the death of Pope St. John Paul II. Victor Manuel Cardinal Fernandez, Prefect. Wow. Guys, what can I say? One thing I will say is that prior to reading this, I heard a lot of people say that all this document goes on and on about is migrants, but that's just not what I read. I just didn't see that. I saw one section, and even in points where you thought that the document might have brought migrants up, they didn't. So I think the critique that it's just all about immigration is just probably coming from a space where the document just wasn't read. I have no interest in getting into church politics or anything like that. I just am trying to love Jesus. I'm trying to love my family. I'm trying to love my daughter. I'm trying to love my wife. I'm trying to be a good Catholic. I'm trying to be a humble son of the church and submit to the church, because I do believe the authority of the church comes from Christ, and I fully submit to Christ. So, with that note, I submit to this document, and I think we owe it to ourselves to really make the time for things like this, to really understand what is the church saying to us in the modern world. I mean, we're living during strange times, but I'm sure in every age people have felt that. And so I think it's so easy these days to be manipulated, and it's so easy for people's opinions on things that the church says to shape our opinions on what the church is. And the only way really to avoid, if you want to cut through lies, you just have to go and ask the person that was actually there. If you want to know what actually happened, you got to speak to the witness. So if you want to know what the document actually says, you actually got to read it. So I hope that if you did stick around, or if you did watch this now live or in the future, I hope that, and I pray that I could just show you guys that I hope that I'm not coming across as, like I'm trying to tell you what to think of the document. I just want to read it and understand it for myself, and I hope I could help you do the same. Thanks very much, guys, for your time. It was really a pleasure to be with you this evening for this stream. I streamed yesterday, I streamed again today. I will probably stream again tomorrow, if not tomorrow, the day after. But I will communicate that to you on the YouTube community tab. If you're new and you watched all the way here, really God bless you. Please consider subscribing, or otherwise feel free just to like this video, just because it makes me feel good when I see that a video's got a lot of likes. And yeah, I appreciate you guys. God bless you, and please pray for me. And I will say a prayer for I'll just say a group prayer for everybody who watched this live stream. I'll say that for you guys tonight when I go to bed. So thanks very much, everyone, for your time. My name is Dylan. This has been Existential Delight. Interesting time in history with the church releasing another document, speaking as a real messenger, refusing to tamper with the message. Before I end this off, I'm going to have one last quick look at the chat. Okay, great. So a lot more people tuned in than I expected, which is awesome. This is, I guess, not niche content if you're Catholic, but thanks for being here, everyone. And on that note, Have a lovely day further, and I will see you guys next time. Goodbye.